This week's episode of the Cloudcast is brought to you by Intel Cloud for All, driving the creation of thousands of clouds.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, Roger, and welcome to the Cloudcast. We're coming to you live from DockerCon here in Barcelona. First of all, huge thank you to the Docker folks for having us again as a media sponsor. Today we have Alexis Richardson, co-founder and CEO of Weaveworks. How you doing? I'm
doing very well, thank you, Aaron.
So, for those that aren't familiar with you, give us a quick background on both yourself and Weaveworks. I'm particularly interested in the RabbitMQ.
Oh, really?
Background a little bit. That was fascinating to me.
Okay. Well, let's start with Weaveworks.
Mm-hmm.
We are a VC-backed company, backed by Accel, founded in July of last year. So we're still pretty young as a company.
Yeah, absolutely.
We have 18 staff in total, including a San Francisco team of 3 right now. Sometimes 4 or 5 when people visit. And we also have a European team, mostly in London, some in Berlin. Myself, my last job was at Pivotal. I was very much involved in all kinds of interesting projects there. I ran, as product manager, the Spring and vFabric businesses. vFabric is the commercial wing of the app business. Plus, did all the stuff to move Spring into the new era of computing.
Mm-hmm.
Because it had kind of got a bit stale with the old J2EE versus Spring debates. No one cared about that anymore. And looked after RabbitMQ and Redis was one of mine, and Tomcat and Web Server were also part of that whole portfoulio.
Very broad background then.
And then before that, I was at VMware, before the spin out into Pivotal. Was involved in some of the early thinking around Cloud Foundry, was part of one of the... Cloud Foundry went through many stages at VMware before it got into Pivotal.
Yes, it did.
And I had some quite intimate involvement in some of those stages. And I also was part of the team that looked at whether we should team up with OpenStack at VMware. I came to VMware because of my company Rabbit getting acquired. I was the CEO and co-founder there too. RabbitMQ was, the MySQL of messaging,
Mm-hmm.
Providing a enterprise quality but developer friendly tool for doing what people used to use IBM MQ series and Tibco for. And I think really opening up the market for distributed systems and showing a new way to do open source, make money at the same time.
Sure.
And before that, I founded a company now called Cohesive Networks with 3 other people. It was originally called Cohesive FT. It was a super early kind of elastic PaaS thing. And that wasn't even my first company. I've done a few before that. Varying degrees of success.
Serial co-founder then.
Something like that, yes.
Yeah. So since we are at DockerCon, we'll get more into Weave here in a little bit. Tell us a little bit more about state of Docker today, state of the Docker ecosystem and networking.
So 2015 has been the year of containers going into production at some scale. The thing that's driving that is primarily developers adopting them, but then operations teams realizing that it's not so much of a problem to have containers in your business. The commercial product manifestation of this, the really important one thing you need to remember is you need a container service.
Mm-hmm.
That's what everyone's going to sell. And these are platforms, like vSphere was a platform. Docker is launching today, I believe, the universal control plane, they're calling it.
Mm-hmm.
That's a container service, okay? That is on-premise competitor to Amazon ECS, and I think you can also run it in the cloud. I can't tell you whether it's ready for use yet. I know it was announced today, but the point is that's where they're going.
Sure.
So you will buy from Docker, number one, the trusted registry, which is where you house your containers in a repository, and number 2, a place to run them, and that's the container service.
Mm-hmm.
And that really is, it's you can see it as a disruption in the VMware play.
Yep.
It's going to run on VMware, but ultimately it's going to sit as a layer above it and replace the need for all of that functionality in the virtualization layer, just as virtualization ultimately made hardware seem like just part of the furniture.
Yep.
So it's the same thing happening all over again. The difference between Docker and VMware is more or less you can run Docker containers anywhere, whereas VMware you could only run on VMware.
Right.
But then you had choice in terms of hardware. Now you have a standard in terms of containers and the container service to run them, and choice in terms of where you deploy it, whether it's Amazon or Azure, Google, or an on-premise. Mm-hmm. And the battle is between who's going to be the main service provider for that. Is it going to be an on-premise game with Docker ahead or VMware doing something? Is it going to be Amazon ahead with ECS or something else?
Sure.
And everybody else is either competing with those guys, providing their own platform, which I think is an acquisition play only, really, or they're doing something on the side. And, actually, there's another exception, which is the platform going higher up the value chain.
Mm-hmm.
So players like Cloud Foundry,
sure.
Offering a PaaS that would be on top of a container service.
Yep.
And then a whole structured sort of complete stack all rolled up into one for you. Apsera is another example of that.
Mm-hmm.
I think Rancher, it could be put into that bucket. If you look at what they're doing, you see a lot of apps running on containers rather than focus on the container service itself.
Yep.
And then there's companies like ourselves who are focused on things like monitoring and management. Mm-hmm. So for every generation of application runtimes, you have a generation of tools around them.
Yep.
And those tools are typically infrastructure, storage, networking, etc., or value add around management and security. So we started off doing only networking.
Right. Yeah, that was going to be my next question. It was interesting to hear you say that because most people associate Weave with WeaveNet.
Yeah, we actually have 3 products.
Right. So tell everyone, because it's probably a really well-kept secret, unfortunately.
It's not secret. It's been on our homepage for a while. But no, seriously, we have 3 different products that are at different stages in their evolutionary cycle.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea is each one is great on its own, and each one is even more awesome used together.
Yep.
But you don't have to use one if you're using one or the others. So Scope is monitoring and visualization for containers, container visibility. And Run is microservices router, which we've been working on for a while.
Mm-hmm.
It's pretty close to release now. Load balancing, service discovery, and so on. And WeaveNet, of course, which gives you all of these things as well, like networking and SDN that developers can use, service discovery that sits on top of that, and automatic address management and a few other things like encryption and so on.
Sure.
And, we found that containers and networking go really great together, but they're not the whole story.
Right. And help us a little bit with that, because probably one of the most common questions that I get is there is confusion of there is so many products out there, and even within Docker, there is so many different products or projects. Help everyone out a little bit with how does everything kind of fit together within this ecosystem? If you were to create an ecosystem that is the Docker, Weaveworks ecosystem.
So I wrote a blog post for the new stack a few weeks ago called the Post-Amazon Challenge.
Okay. I'll dig it up and put it in
There's
the
a stack on there which I
doubt.
think is a pretty good approximation, which has automated infrastructure at the bottom, which is things like Amazon Cloud, VMware data centers, with a whole layer of tooling on top to deploy things. And then a middle layer called the container service, which is a standard runtime for containerized apps, cloud-native applications that can run anywhere. And finally, on top, value-added domain-specific tools, like a PaaS, for example, or Netflix OSS microservices toolkit, or something to do with data, perhaps, or data services. And that is a simple model, but I think it's the correct one. Now, the first thing you need to ask if you come across a new product is, are they one of these things?
Right.
Or are they trying to roll up all of these things? So I mentioned before Pivotal, Cloud Foundry, and Apsera, good examples of trying to combine elements of multiple layers into one product. That's a good thing to do if you talk to customers who need one throat to choke.
Yes.
Typically bigger customers.
Yes.
With more complex needs. There's another approach, which is much more unstructured, unopinionated, where you choose one of each layer. So you might say, I'm going to run on Amazon, but I'm going to use a Kubernetes as my container service, not ECS. And I'm going to run, Python apps on top of that, or Python and Spring apps, for example. That's another way to go. But that easily fits into the model. If you go downstairs and wander around the trade floor here, you need to say how many of these people are doing a container service fundamentally, or a layer on top of that. And a lot of them are doing that. And then the way to find out is to find out, are they trying to do everything? As soon as you hear that somebody needs every single piece of the stack in their product, they are trying to do everything. And that's called a platform play.
Sure.
And then you've got people who are much more specific to functions like ourselves. So we've found that networking is a spectacular enabler of microservices and a really good thing to focus on when doing monitoring and management, because a lot of the things you need to think about when managing a microservices app are in the network. But that doesn't mean that's the whole story.
Right.
It just means you need a good network there. So, if somebody's doing something like monitoring and management, that means they're not a platform player and they're off to the side adding value, orthogonally, additional value.
Yep. And you mentioned it earlier. I just want to pick your brain a little bit too. So a lot of people are trying to understand too, where does CoreOS and Kubernetes fit into all of this, whether it's into Weaveworks specifically or again into this bigger picture kind of things. You hear a lot of talk on the floor of talking to the vendors here, and they're like, "Oh yeah, we absolutely work with Docker. Oh, and we work with Kubernetes." And they kind of make sure to throw that in there, and so it's almost become the swarm swap out and replacement. But I don't know that that's correct, right? There's definitely some overlap, but then there's also complementary as well. You
could run Swarm as an API on top of Kubernetes, or even have a combined implementation, no question. But I think today they're better thought of as alternatives. We'll see where it goes in the future. I think there's a very strong will in the containers community for these things to converge.
Yes. There was actually talk in the Docker Futures session yesterday about that.
If Docker can make money out of a universal control plane, they won't care whether the open source piece is entirely Swarm, entirely Kubernetes, or some horrible beast made out of both. But Kubernetes and Swarm are a container service as well. The Universal Control Plane is a commercial product they've advertised this morning, commercial packaging around those open source layers. In their case, I'm sure around Docker Swarm with some commercial stuff coming in. Kubernetes is an alternative container service. It has some different features. It has more support maybe for large-scale operations perhaps than is in Docker Swarm today. You can run Kubernetes wherever you like. If you run it on WeaveNet, by the way, it's super easy to run it wherever you like.
Yes.
And you can monitor it using Scope. It's really cool. You should try that. But it is a container service, and that's why you're going to use it. It's a platform. But it's open source, and it's missing some of the things maybe that some customers will want. So there are companies springing up around it, like Chorus and Kismatic, and Red Hat with OpenShift, which embeds Kubernetes. And Deis are embedding Kubernetes, and WSO2 embed Kubernetes in their Stratos platform. All of these guys are saying, we're going to add more value around the core Kubernetes engine to give you a bigger platform. And so, number one, they're all platform plays. Number two, they're embedding the Kubernetes container service. CoreOS specifically, they also go down the stack because they have some of the OS tooling that you might need. That's part of their delivery model. And they obviously have these special purpose services like etcd and Flannel, which are coordination and networking respectively. Normally these are individual services you need within. If you peer inside what's going on behind the scenes in a container service, you'll see things like etcd or Weave all being part of the fabric. But, many customers don't necessarily want to use those individually.
Right.
And some do and some don't.
Sure.
You've got to cater to all of these things.
Yep.
So the market is segmented more or less among the people who want to do it themselves, people who want to do some of it themselves, and people who want someone else to do it all.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. Absolutely. Well, that's fantastic. So we're kind of out of time for today. Alexis, where can everyone find out more about both you and Weaveworks and of course, the entire product portfolio and what you guys have going on?
Please go to our website, http://weave.works, and take a look. And please get in touch.
Fantastic. All right. So, Alexis, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Aaron.
Everyone, thank you for listening. Appreciate it. Take care.
Thank you for listening to the Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.